In the last video, I talked about how to make the foot and how to smooth it, so I'm going to go ahead and finish this up, and you may already have that completed. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that clay towards the middle, and I'm applying a little bit of pressure as I do this. And then of course I'm going to use my rib tool, or if you have a popsicle stick, you'll use your popsicle stick to compress this clay. Remember, you cannot over compress your clay. It's just not possible. And kind of a good rule to live by when you're building in clay is anytime that you rib something, you use your rib tool. Remember, it's spelled R-I-B, but anytime you do that, you want to follow it up with your sponge. And I'm just kind of rolling this to get it to the kind of the same thickness all the way around, and just getting that round shape back. And with my bowl and my saran wrap still in place, I'm going to go ahead and put the foot of my coil pot inside the bowl. So our next step is to get our slip out. And if you haven't made any slip, it's just clay and water chopped up and mixed up. And I'm going to go ahead and use my paintbrush here, and I'm going to apply this slip along this top outside edge. My slip's a little bit dry. I could use a little bit of water. And then I'm going to score that area, and I'm going to use my fork because it goes a little bit faster. And it is going to look a bit messy, but that's no big deal. Don't worry about that. In ceramics, it tends to look a little bit messy before it looks nice and pretty. Make sure that you are doing adequate scoring marks, because if not, then that process is kind of pointless. So now I'm going to take one of my coils and I'm going to set it at the edge of that foot. Sometimes the saran wrap gets a little bit in the way, so you just kind of have to move it. But I'm going to put it on the edge of that foot, keeping the foot in the middle, and just kind of pressing it down so it goes into the wall of my bowl, because that's going to act as my mold. And I like to use this approach for beginners just because it gives you an idea and you concentrate more on the coiling rather than the structure itself, because the bowl is acting as kind of your stencil. So if your coil is too long, like mine, you can just tear it off. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do what's called pulling. So I'm going to pull the clay from the coil onto the foot of my coil pot. So with my finger, I'm just going to apply pressure. And sometimes you have to hold it on this side because that saran wrap likes to make it slide. So I'm going to pull with my finger. So I'm pushing down on that coil and pulling into the foot. Now notice that I'm not stopping just like right there, because that's not going to connect that coil. You have to make sure you're coming all the way to the foot. Notice that I'm overlapping my pull marks, so don't just randomly do this wherever you want. Make sure you're overlapping. I tend to go over it a couple times, push in and towards the middle. And if you did your coils properly, so if you made them the thickness of your thumb, then your clay wall should still be a consistent thickness. So when I'm doing my pull marks, I'm trying to apply the same amount of pressure every single time, just like you did when you did your pinch pot. And I'm just going to go back through and I'm going to smooth this out. I'm just applying just a slight amount of pressure as I do this. Okay, now we're going to repeat that step over and over again all the way to the top of the bowl. So I'm going to apply some slip to the top of this coil, and then I'm going to score with my fork. Get that saran wrap out of the way. Take my coil, set it on top of the previous section, gently pressing so it's going into the bowl. So it shouldn't be, your coil shouldn't be way out here. It should be up against that bowl wall, sitting on the previous section of the coil pot. And I like to make sure it's up against that clay, the bowl wall. And then I'm going to repeat this process, pulling my clay into the foot. And notice that I didn't line my seams up to my coils. I didn't line them up exactly where the other ones were. You don't want to do that, because if you line up your coils exactly in the same place, then you're going to create a weak point on the clay wall. So it's a good idea to kind of remember where they are and just kind of stagger them. And if your clay moves a little bit, just move it back. It's not going to hurt it. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to smooth this out. And I like to go back and forth between my pointer finger and my thumb. And we're going to use the popsicle stick here in just a little bit, but we don't need it at the moment. If you get a built up mound of clay right in here in the middle, just kind of smooth that out. So once again, I'm going to put some water in my slip because it is getting kind of dry. And then I'm just going to stir it up. There we go, that's better. So apply to the previous coil. Score with your fork. And attach your next coil. So if you're having problems making coils, it takes practice. If you're getting a square coil, then you're not rolling the coil from the palm of your hand to the fingertips. You're probably only rolling halfway. If your coils are breaking, your clay is probably dry. Or if they're cracking, your clay is probably dry. That happens a lot, and that's a big mistake that beginners make. They let their clay get too dry. If your body temperature, if you run kind of hot, it's going to dry out your clay faster. So if you're spending a lot of time kind of handling your clay before you make the coil, that's probably a benefactor as to why your coils are cracking. And so you would want to make your coils quicker, basically. But it's something, it takes practice, so don't give up. Because we're pressing it into a bowl mold, they don't necessarily have to be perfect, but you do want to try to get them as even as you can, or else your clay wall is going to be uneven. I noticed that I kind of switched to my thumb because I can hold the outside of the bowl as I pull this clay down. And I think it's just a little bit easier, but if you feel like it's easier to use your fingers still, you absolutely can do that. But I'm still pushing in and then pulling down, and I'm not stopping right under the coil. Remember, I'm going down into the foot. If you don't pull that coil as far as you can, then your coil is definitely going to pop off and your coil pot is going to fall apart. So I'm just going to go back in and I'm going to smooth all of this up with my finger. I'm applying a little bit of pressure as I do this. And if you are at home and all you have is a popsicle stick, you can use that to help you compress the clay. So I'm just kind of overlapping as I kind of scrape the inside. If you are here on campus or you have access to clay tools, you can use your rib. So I'm going to use the rounded side of my rib tool, and I'm just going to compress this clay wall. And I'm still supporting the clay wall because this bowl is plastic, so it does move. So I still want to make sure that I'm supporting it as I compress that clay. If your clay does start to come above the rim of your bowl, that is not a huge deal because we're going to trim it anyway. Okay, if you have a popsicle stick, you're going to cut into your clay, and I'm keeping it right on the side, so it's going to be level with this edge right here. And I'm just going to turn and notice that I'm keeping the popsicle stick flat. That way, it's even with the edge of my bowl. If you are here at campus and you have access to a needle tool, then you can use a needle tool to do the exact same thing. So we'll take our needle tool and put it at the edge of your bowl so you can hear it's laying flat, so it's laying horizontal. And I'll just go, keeping it flat, I'll just turn the bowl, and voila, now we've got a nice even rim. So to finish this inside up, I'm going to spray it with some water, take my sponge, and I'm going to get rid of all those rib marks. So I'm applying pressure into the clay, and the clay is really it should be pretty wet. Coiling, you want your clay to have quite a bit of moisture in it when you're making coils for beginners. It just makes it easier. So your clay is going to move really easily, so just be careful whenever you're smoothing it out that you don't apply too much pressure and you make one area thinner than it needs to be. And there you go, you have the inside of your coil pot completed, and the coils are all smoothed in, we've compressed it, and we've smoothed it out. So now we're ready for the next step. At this point, you've smoothed in the inside of your bowl, and you have your saran wrap, and what you're going to do is you're going to use your saran wrap to help you get your clay out of the bowl itself. And it can be a little bit tricky, but don't worry if you bend the clay a little bit, because it's so wet that we'll be able to reshape it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to flip our bowl over, and mine has a little bit of a lip here, but that's no big deal. I'll get rid of it here in a second. It is going to imprint on the inside of my bowl, but that's okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our saran wrap. If you want to use new saran wrap, that's okay, you can, but I'm just going to recycle what I had on the inside. I'm going to place on the outside of my bowl. I'm going to take my clay structure, so the inside is smooth, but the outside is not. So I'm going to place it on my bowl, and it's okay if it gets a little bit wider, or you have to apply pressure to get it on here, because what it's going to do is it's going to keep your bowl from collapsing while you smooth in these coils. Now, if you are at home or you don't have access to a rib tool, then you can use a popsicle stick, and that can act as kind of like your fingers or your thumbs, and that can help you pull down that clay just like this. However, I like to use my fingertips for this, and my thumb, so I'm just going to pull that clay down. I'm pushing in slightly and pulling down. If you push too hard, then you could potentially put a coal in your coil pot wall. So be careful. If you made your coils too skinny, that could also be a potential problem. And if that happens, then you can patch it as long as your clay is wet enough. And on the outside, notice that I'm going from top to bottom. So I'm going back and forth as I do this. But also be aware that I'm overlapping these pull marks. So I'm not just kind of working randomly wherever I want. I'm staying in one section until I get those coils all smoothed in. And if you feel like you've got a little bit of a lump from a coil, then that's the section that you need to kind of work out until this clay wall feels really even, the same thickness all the way around. And notice I tend to kind of overlap, even though I'm not working this area. I'll probably continuously go back to that section, kind of over and over and over again. Applying just a slight amount of pressure as you do this so you can get that clay to move. And as you kind of compress and pull over and over again, it helps to smooth that clay wall out. outside of my pot, and I've compressed it with my rib tool. I'm gonna go back in, and like always, I'm gonna smooth this up with my sponge. Don't add a whole lot of water to this because your clay has a lot of moisture in it. If you add too much water, it's just gonna cause problems, and it's gonna make it hard to move, and it's gonna make it hard to smooth. Just doing some last minute kind of smoothing. And like I said, once it gets a little bit more dry, it is much easier to get this all smoothed out. So at this point, we're gonna take our smoothed in bowl, and we need to put it back into our mold, because if we leave it out like this, it's going to collapse because it has so much water in it. So we're gonna put it back inside our bowl with the saran wrap gently. And it has widened because we smoothed it in on the outside of the bowl, so it did widen a little bit. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna press it back down in here, and then we're gonna give it an additional smooth with our sponge. You could use your popsicle stick and your rib as well. And I'm gonna get rid of the marks from the bottom of that bowl because I don't like that. So I'm just gonna do some additional smoothing. Which is a good idea for everyone because we did stretch it out when we put it on the outside. And then I'm going to cover this so this can set up. Make sure it is completely covered. And because I stretched this out a little bit, the rim of my coil pot is now above the edge of the bowl once more. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna trim that again. So whichever tool you have access to, your popsicle stick or your needle tool, make sure your saran wrap is out of the way. And I'm gonna go ahead and trim that up. At this point, if you've got an area on the rim of your coil pot that is way thinner than another, so I've got a little thin spot right here, now's the time. You can go ahead and you can fix this up. You're just gonna take a really tiny coil, and your clay is wet enough, you can just lay it on the side, just like that, and smooth that into the clay wall. If you have to do this though, you're going to want to recompress and re-sponge because you don't want to leave it all messy like this because the rest of your coil pot looks really nice. At this point, we're gonna let this set up. So it looks like a cereal bowl right now, and that's okay. That's what we want it to look like. We're gonna put it inside our big bag to let it set up. We're not gonna spray it with any water, but we are gonna make sure that this is completely sealed. We're gonna make sure that this is completely sealed with no air in it, and we'll come back to it in a few days and do the other side.